Now, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, 4Air. 4Air is leading the way with the industry's first framework to address aviation's climate impact, offering clear, verifiable pathways to reduce and counteract aircraft emissions. Their new Assure SAF registry is making it easier than ever to manage and claim sustainable aviation fuel usage across the value chain. Want to learn more? Check out the show notes.
Actually, there are studies out there. They say that if you use carbon dioxide removal plus continue to use fossil jet fuel, it's actually more economical, up to seven times more economical than producing sustainable aviation fuels. So I think there can be an argument made also on the economics why this could help.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Christoph Gebald, co-founder and co-CEO of Climeworks. It's a global leader in direct air capture technology. Since its inception in 2009, Climeworks has built the world's first and largest direct air capture and storage plant in Iceland, and it's now partnering with major airlines like Lufthansa and British Airways to make aviation more sustainable. In this episode, Christoph also shares some great insights into the future of carbon removal, its crucial role in sustainable aviation, and why he believes the combination of both technological and natural solutions is essential for tackling the climate crisis. Christoph, it is a pleasure to be recording after our very nice personal meeting at New York Climate Week. I was very impressed after reading and learning so much about Climeworks to finally meet you in person, and it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Shashank. It's really nice to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious. Let's start from the beginning. In 2009, you and Jan founded Climeworks, which now is one of the global leaders in direct air capture. What sparked your initial interest in carbon removal?
The initial interest went back to actually a very simple thought. We both, my co-founder Jan and I, we are trained as engineers. And when you study engineering, you're learning about energy and you're learning about materials, and everything in engineering is about closing balances. So when you study engineering for years, you talk about closed energy balances, closed material balances. And the very fundamental thing it's a pretty obvious one we came across is the material balance for CO2 is simply not closed, right? We're dumping billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere per year, but we're not doing anything to it. And for us, it was sort of logic, even in the absence of climate science teaching that this has to be done, that at one point in our future, we need technologies to get the CO2 back out of the air. So that was the very fundamental thought, actually 17 years ago when we started research and 15 years ago when we started the company. And today, I'm extremely thankful. And that's not only today, it happened already several years back, that actually what we do is confirmed by climate science and absolutely needed in order to achieve climate targets.
What's interesting is our company is almost exactly the same age. We started in 2009, 17 years ago as well, working with airlines on, how do you build trust with customers? And it dawned upon us when we were 15 years in that, to build trust in customers, airlines have to get sustainability right. Applying this to aviation, applying direct air capture to aviation, what role do you envision for carbon removal in achieving sustainable air travel?
Well, I do hope, and it's a really good question, and actually it reminds me of 2009 when we started the company. So today, when I think about aviation and when I think about what we do, it is sort of the same logic. It's like, or the same idea. It's entirely logic that carbon removal and aviation have to go together in order to like solve this challenge of sustainable aviation. I'm afraid at the moment only some very visionary aviation companies are using that, and it's not recognized as a mainstream solution to do that. However, and hopefully already in the short term or midterm, I do hope that carbon removal on the one hand will be used to address the carbon emissions that are created by aviation. So essentially, aviation emits CO2 to the atmosphere. We build machines to pull it back out of the atmosphere and store it on the ground, right? That's the one thing. Then the second thing is a lot of talk is on sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, right? And some novel sustainable aviation fuels think about using CO2 as a feedstock, combine it with hydrogen, and eventually produce the sustainable aviation fuel. And their direct air capture could also play a role because it's essentially providing an unlimited sustainable source of carbon for producing SAF. And lastly, this is maybe a bit further in the future, but science starts to talk about that. They are warming effects of aviation going back to the carbon emissions, but there are also non-carbon warming components like contrails, right? And maybe in the future, like aviation even needs to overcompensate the CO2 emissions, but think about further warming effects. And there also carbon removal can be an opportunity to, if you want, simply speaking, induce additional cooling in the atmosphere to compensate for that. So it's three pillars that where I see a role for carbon removal and aviation.
Thank you so much for succinctly sharing the three pillars with us. I want to zoom out a little. For those who may be unfamiliar, what is the difference between DAC, direct air capture, what you're doing, versus CCU and CCUS? There are a lot of these terms going around. What is, a one-on-one difference between DAC, CCU, and CCUS?
Well, very fundamentally, to achieve climate targets, which essentially means net zero by 2050, we need two things to happen. The first one is massive emission reductions, which account for roughly 90% of the exercise we have to do. Now, no matter how hard we reduce our CO2 emissions, the understanding is that we'll be sitting roughly on a pillar of 10% of so-called hard-to-abate emissions that have to be removed from the atmosphere. And together, the 90% and the 10% will be 100% reduction, and in such net zero. Now, to your question, what is the difference between CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, or storage, and CDR, carbon dioxide removal, is that CCUS plays in the field of CO2 reduction. So it helps us to reduce CO2 concentration or CO2 emissions that we're having today, like down to 90%. And what we are doing, carbon dioxide removal, is essentially the 10% pillar of hard to abate or unavoidable emissions that need to be removed from the air. Now, a very simple, let me give you some very simple examples. A simple example is an electric car, which every one of us imagines as something clean, which it is. And imagine a wind turbine next to the electric car, and the wind turbine provides the electron for the car. So it's a very beautiful, clean image. However, it's not 0 grams or pounds or whatever you want per kilogram or mile traveled. It's some remaining emissions because of the steel, the battery materials, the concrete to build the
lithium and what goes in the battery.
Exactly. And that needs to be removed in order to be to a real net zero, and that is the role of us. So this is how reduction and removal, so to say, go together.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Now, if we go to your technology itself, I believe in 2022, you broke ground on your Mammoth plant. It's actually not just mammoth in size, it is called Mammoth as a noun, in Iceland, which is capable of removing 36,000 tons of CO2 annually. Scaling up from Orca, which was your first large scale plant, now to Mammoth, what have been some of the key lessons that you've learned along the way?
You know, when we built Orca, that is actually the world's first plant that was in 2021, or it went online in 2021. First plant globally taking CO2 from the air and storing it in the ground. And when it was like a 2-year process to engineer it, to build it. So you're doing a lot of reviews, you're seeing a lot of engineering diagrams. You try to optimize whatever is possible. But standing there and seeing it and having the field data was so helpful in order to further optimize it. And we created so many ideas out of it, what we can do better, and all of which are implemented in Mammoth. And we thought, this is like the best of what we learned, and we implemented. Now, take a guess. The same happened with Mammoth. So we engineered it, we built it, we did a lot of reviews, we implemented all learnings we had for Orca into Mammoth. So from our first plant to our second plant, again, standing there, seeing the measurement results. There are already so many ideas on how we can improve our technology. I think this is what's called the power of technology, right? It's like you're taking a step, you're learning so much from it, and you're implementing it in the next generation of technology. And this is essentially what we get from Mammoth, from our second plant, as like a school book full of learnings that we will implement in our next plant. And I'm afraid, of course, we try to get as much learnings as possible without building plants, but I'm of the very deep conviction that especially for a topic like we have, you have to get out there, you have to deploy it, and this is when you start to learn. And that's essentially like what we're learning from Mammoth is exactly the right thing. It's exactly the right thing to do it, to build it, to learn from it, and take the next step to scale, reduce the cost.
It's so interesting. I want to dig a little deeper. I know this technology can be deployed anywhere. You just, you have like big vacuum cleaner fans sucking air, and then you're taking the carbon out of there. But why Iceland? Why are your plants in Iceland? I thought there are way more polluted cities where you can easily just get carbon dioxide from the air.
Well, the CO2 in the air is actually very well diluted, right? If you pull CO2 at any location globally, be it Iceland, be it the United States, be it China, be it wherever, right? It has a global impact. Actually, the diffusion or the mixing of CO2 and the atmosphere globally happens on the order of days, right? So what that means is if we start to pull CO2 from the atmosphere in Iceland and store it in the ground, we have a global impact, or we can serve global customers by doing that. Now, why Iceland is because of a couple of reasons. It's an excellent place to store CO2 in the underground. And it's a place where this can be readily done already today, not in the future. Like Iceland, 2 decades ago, already started to research on permanent and safe underground storage of CO2. And this is what we're profiting from. So in Iceland, we found a site where we can deploy our plant already today and store CO2 permanently and safely in the ground. The second thing is to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, you need energy, right? It's not because Climeworks is an inefficient process or something. It is physics. Like, in order to get CO2 out of the air, physics tell you need a lot of energy to do that. So you want to do that at a place where you have access to low carbon, low cost energy. And you'll have a hard time to beat the low carbon intensity we're having in Iceland and the low cost that we're seeing in Iceland. So putting those together, the possibility to store CO2 in the ground and the access to low carbon energy are really good ingredients to start our journey to capture CO2 from the air.
I remember when we met, you told me about the story of meeting the former Iceland Prime Minister at a WEF conference. Did that have anything to do with you locating in Iceland?
Indeed, a reason we located in Iceland, it goes back to a meeting between the former president of Iceland,
There you go.
Olafur Grimsson, at a COP conference in Morocco and in Marrakesh in the year 2016, where I due to serendipity met this gentleman and had a chance to tell him about what we do. And he told me about his vision that in Iceland they started researching on permanent storage of CO2 in the underground, but they were lacking technology to pull CO2 from the air, which is the missing piece to his vision, which is to be the pumping station of the planet in reverse. So after meeting him, he invited me to his country and said we should meet the researchers and the team behind the underground storage project. And this led to a first pilot plant, actually already 6 months after the former president and I met. And from there, we started our scaling journey in Iceland.
Wow. Never underplay the luck factor, right? Serendipitously you meet him and here we go, right?
Yeah, serendipity is a big part of the success indeed.
Absolutely. Direct air capture is a type of offsetting, like you said, the hard to abate part, the 10%, right? But we've recently seen traditional carbon offsets come under increasing scrutiny. When you speak with airlines and others, how do you communicate the value proposition of direct air capture compared with other conventional offsets? I'm thinking simple things like tree planting or mangroves.
Generally speaking, like traditional offsets, which are largely avoidance, and what we are doing, carbon dioxide removal, are two different things. Like avoidance credits are CO2 reduction, so it helps to reduce CO2, whereas the domain we work in, carbon dioxide removal, is the domain of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, both are needed in order to achieve our climate targets, right? However, only carbon removal will bring us to net zero. So a very simple example is if an airline, so I'm based in Zurich, say I'm flying Zurich, Boston, where you're based at the moment, and I'm buying carbon offset credits for that. That's a good thing to do, right? But the CO2, if you want, stays in the atmosphere. So it's not rendering the operations in a net zero way. What it does is it helps to avoid the emission of CO2 elsewhere. Say, it helps to provide the financing for a renewable energy plant in another part of the world instead of building a fossil plant, right? But the CO2 that is emitted through the airplane, for example, stays in the atmosphere. Now, if the same customer or the same airline bought a carbon removal credit instead of an avoidance credit, what happens is that actually the CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and the airline can claim that the operations are happening in a net zero manner, right? Again, both is needed, right? It's not a or discussion. So we need both reduction and removal. Actually, we need much more reduction than removal in order to achieve climate targets. So both should be done, but they should not be excluded. So someone playing in the field of reduction should not sit back and say, well, I provided my share that I need to do. On top of that, removal needs to happen. And you know what? So what we talk with airlines in order to like convince them and think about carbon removal as a addition to the efforts they're already doing is to think about like the concept of net zero and how to achieve net zero, to think about the value of permanent removal. Like what we do is once the CO2 is in the ground, it stays there essentially on geological timescales. So it is out of the atmosphere. And that fundamentally is the value proposition or the very fundamental difference between additional offsets and what we're doing.
Very interesting. And you've, of course, made significant headway because now you have deals with airlines like Swiss, Lufthansa, and British Airways. What are some of the unique challenges you've encountered when working with airlines and getting them over the line?
It's fundamentally two things. On the one hand, airlines are like in the context of sustainability, airlines are heavily focused on sustainable aviation fuels and actually their mandates, right? Whereas for carbon dioxide removal, I'm afraid currently there's no regulation or no mandate to be fulfilled. So if we're buying sustainable aviation fuels helps airlines to fulfill their mandates, currently buying carbon removal credits is not. So that is a fundamental challenge and requires, of course, some pioneering attitude and or visionary attitude, some like intrinsic motivation from the airlines to get this going. The second aspect is, for some reason, I can't explain you why, but for some reason, aviation is like in the public domain under scrutiny when it comes to climate targets, and you can feel that when you talk to players in the field, that they look at the solution that you're presenting them in a very thorough way and think about it in many dimensions in order to evaluate how will the public actually react to such a thing. Will the public think about it as greenwashing, or will it think about this is real climate action and that is helpful? So I think those two things, that on the one hand, the current mandates in SAF and the scrutiny or the stage light, if you want, that aviation sees when it comes to climate, are things that we are seeing over and over, and where we spend a lot of time in explaining and finding models that fit to each of those players.
Right. I remember recently Bill Gates was asked, you take so many private jet flights, how do you take care of your carbon footprint? And he says, oh, you know what? I actually offset my flying through direct air capture. He's a big fan. But of course, he pays the price for it as well. If we get down to pricing, direct air capture is not something that's cheap. It, in fact, is one of the more expensive ways to offset the carbon footprint of an airline. Yet airlines are tight margin businesses. One, how do you get them over the hump for buying your high quality, more expensive offsets? And second, how do you see these costs coming down over time?
Cost or expensive is not an absolute thing, but like a relative thing. So it's all a matter of comparison, right? To talk numbers, currently our cost is in the high triple-digit dollars per ton of CO2 avoided. So currently we are in the market with, say, $600 to $800 per ton of CO2 net, like net ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. Now, what does that compare to, right? If you look into, say, the early days of solar or wind deployment 20 years ago, like in the 2000s, and if you calculate, like, wind is not priced in dollars per ton of CO2 avoided, but in dollars per kilowatt hours produced. So it's a different unit, but you can convert the two. And if you do that, you figure out like early days solar is in the range of $800 per ton of CO2 avoided, similar as wind. If you look into battery electric vehicles, it's the same. If you compare a BEV to an internal combustion engine car, you can calculate how much dollars are you spending per ton of CO2 avoided, and you'll figure out it's also in the high triple digits. All of them, however, being technology solution, come down over time. And today, for example, solar energy is among the cheapest energy sources on the planet, right? And the same will happen to our technology. I don't see any reason why there shouldn't be technological learning and the costs come down. So what we see as realistic, that the cost will come down over time to somewhere in the range of $100 to $200 per ton. The big question is, when will that happen? Our models say this will happen in like 15 years from now, in 2040. But I think it rather depends on the scale than the time. So it rather depends on how many million tons per year installed capacity do exist than the exact timeline. Now, when it comes to aviation companies, today, price-wise, we are already very competitive to sustainable aviation fuels, right? If you calculate what is the dollar per ton of CO2 avoided by buying SAF, it's the same numbers, right? Depends on, of course, which type of sustainable aviation fuel you're buying. But the likelihood you're ending up with a figure in the range of $500 per ton, $600 per ton is high for advanced second generation, third generation sustainable aviation fuels. In such, we're actually price competitive. However, we're not competitive, or we're currently not mandatory because regulation is not asking for it. Actually, there are studies out there. They say that if you use carbon dioxide removal plus like continue to use fossil jet fuel, it's actually more economical, like 7 times, up to 7 times more economical than producing sustainable aviation fuels. So I think there can be an argument made also on the economics why this could help, and this is how we're able to convince customers in this domain that they're working together with us.
It's so interesting, right? Because a lot of the airlines' total emissions are growing as they grow, even though their per seat mile emissions are going down. So they have to look at options like direct air capture for taking care of their additional emissions, which because aviation is a hard to abate sector. But I do understand that this is not mutually exclusive with SAF. For example, eSAF or powder liquid, you can use direct air capture that you're providing to provide the CO2 that's needed to combine with hydrogen and others to make eSAF. Isn't that right?
That's exactly the case. So there's a double benefit. If you use carbon dioxide removal from direct air capture today, the double benefit you'll have is that you're supporting the development of a technology, direct air capture, that can A, be used to take CO2 from the air and store it in the ground, and B, it can be used to provide a sustainable, essentially unlimited feedstock to producing e-kerosene, if you want, like e-fuels from CO2 and green hydrogen. So there is this double benefit in scaling direct air capture for the aviation industry.
It's heartening to know, because it's not about a zero-sum game. It's about multiple technologies working together for a coherent, more sustainable future. Now, if we go to another topic, going back to your technology, talk to us about your Generation 3 technology, which you unveiled recently. Doubles the CO2 capture capacity per module while halving the energy consumption. One, how is this possible? And how does this ultimately drive adoption within aviation?
How is this possible? Because it's like early days of the technology, right? Like we built our first of a kind plant in 2017, 7 years ago. And from that we learned, and we built our first plant in Iceland, our second plant in Iceland. The next one we built is in the United States. I always compare that to building the first car, right? The first car was essentially rectangular and had, 20 horsepower. Maybe I'm 100% sure I'm wrong. It's either less or more. And today cars are like hyper aerodynamic and have hundreds of horsepower, either in combustion engines or electric engines, super fast acceleration. This is like the first plant you're not building with the prospect of it being the most efficient plant. You're building it to show that it's actually working, that it's robust, that this can be done technologically. The second plant, you're implementing some learnings, and over time you're improving. And so our Generation 3 is essentially, as the name says, the third iteration of our technology generation. And we took some courageous steps and thought, listen, we simply try some means in order to get more air through the system, in order to reduce the energy consumption. And that won't be the end of the game. Like, there will be further such announcements. Like I'm absolutely sure and confident that there will be a Generation 4 and 5 technology, yet halving the cost and yet reducing the energy consumption quite substantially, right? Now, the way we do that at the moment, Climeworks as a company is at the moment roughly 500 FTEs, roughly growing 40% year on year. And more than half of our FTEs are working in tech development. So the only thing they do day in, day out is think about the materials that we're using, think about the processes that we're using. We invest triple-digit million-dollar sums in order to build assets and infrastructure in order to test the innovations that we're having, and eventually they make it to the field. And this is the novelty that happened this year, that Generation 3 was de-risked sufficiently that we announced it and that we now make it part of our deployment roadmap. Now, what effect that will have on aviation is a sector that is rather price sensitive. Why? Because in aviation, a large share of the expenditures are related to the fuel and in such also related to the emissions. It's all quite linear to each other. And in such a breakthrough like reducing the costs by a substantial share is really big news to aviation, and lower cost is higher market share, and that is what will happen. So I wouldn't be surprised if in 2 years down the road, not only 3 companies globally in that domain were using it, but 30 companies globally were thinking about carbon dioxide removal as a important pillar in their sustainability strategy.
Well, I'm quite upbeat about direct air capture. I think when we met at New York Climate Week, you talked about how I think investment in DAC has grown 10x in the last 2 years. Is that right? Did I get that statistic right?
You got that right. In the last 2 years, I think it's even more than 10x. But the order of magnitude is correct, that between 2022 and 2024, the market grew by more than 10x. And actually, this year, as the first time, dollar volume wise, the carbon dioxide removal industry passed the global voluntary carbon market, which is the big news in such a, essentially was created over the last 5 to 10 years. So that is, it's developing in a very progressive way.
And when you say market has grown, you're talking about the entire market. Who are your big competitors? Do you have competitors, given how hard it is to get into this technology?
Well, of course, we have competitors. We don't think about them as competitors because why I'm saying that carbon dioxide removal will not be a winner-takes-it-all market. It's way, way, way too big in order for one company and one approach to serve it. In 2050, the numbers are, so the scientific numbers, if you want, 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide removal that have to be removed from the atmosphere. If one company did that on their own, this would be by orders of magnitude, the largest company in any scale that would be existing on Earth. So my view of the future is that in 25 years from now, there's something like 20 to 30 major companies, all of them as big as today's oil and gas companies, revenue-wise, serving this market, right? Now, of course, there are many competing. I think Bloomberg recently said that there are hundreds of carbon dioxide removal companies, and they are working in different pillars. They're working in direct air capture, the one that we work in. I think it's 100 of them in this pillar. Then, of course, afforestation, reforestation is a carbon dioxide removal approach, enhanced weathering, biochar, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. You ask about the biggest competitor, or the biggest deal flow as of speaking at the moment is a thing called BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. What is that? That is essentially burning biomass in a bioenergy plant, producing electricity and heat from it, and then capturing the CO2 from the stack and storing it.
So it's at the source. It's at that source where you're burning it.
Exactly. And the logic is that the biomaterial that you're burning at first place captured CO2 from the air in order to grow, right? Photosynthesis. Now, if you burn them and capture the CO2 at the stack and store it on the ground, you have actually a net stream of CO2 taken from the air through the plant, then going through the chimney, but you capture it and store it in the ground. This is the largest volumes, probably 70% of the current market share is BECCS. So it's high volume, it's lower cost than direct air capture at the moment. Now, what we'll see going forward is that the price curves will meet somewhere. For BECCS, as it's called, currently has access to, since the supply chain is not yet very developed, there are some low-hanging fruits where you can have actually access to waste biomaterials, and where you have a bioenergy plant where you can use it and interlinked with the storage side. Now, over time, those supply chain effects will become more complex, and such the solution will be becoming more expensive, whereas our solution over time will grow in volume. We'll have further breakthroughs and we'll reduce the cost. And at some point, the cost curve intersects, and then it'll be cost competitive with each other.
Wow. If we still talk about capacity and scale, right? You want to reach a megaton capacity by 2030 and a gigaton capacity by 2050. Firstly, give us what is a megaton? How many houses can it power, or how much? What is this magnitude we're talking about relatively? And you know, what are some of the milestones you will need to get there ultimately to meet these targets?
Quantitatively, think about a conventional power plant, right? Like a fossil fuel power plant that is emitting millions of tons of CO2 to the atmosphere per annum. And if we are building a plant removing a million tons from the atmosphere, think about it like a power plant working in reverse. Think about the image of a coal power plant in front of you, or a natural gas fired power plant, and think of it simply going backwards, like the image of the chimney, like sucking the CO2 back into it and storing it underneath in the ground. And actually, size wise, it's quite comparable, and also investment wise, it's quite comparable. So one fossil plant depends on what size and what energy source is used, 1 to 5, 6 megatons of CO2 from the air per year, and we have -1 per plant, right? And the milestones there, we are working with modular technology. Like we and this is sort of, it sounds very trivial, but this is sort of one of the key innovations in the domain we're working is. Typically, the domain we're working in is it's a domain where everything is newly engineered for one application. Like you have one power plant, like a gas-fired power plant, a coal-fired power plant. It's like one thing, right? We think about our technology rather modular, rather as a solar plant, if you want, like a photovoltaic collector, a wind turbine. So we achieve scale not by making our power plant bigger, but by multiplying it, right? And that has a couple of interesting aspects. First is that we can leverage economies of mass production, if you want, right? And the second thing is that we can de-risk our technology quite nicely when scaling. So we decided to scale in 10x, 10x, 10x scale-up steps. And what we have done is we have come to a scale of several 10,000s of tons of CO2 installed. We are currently in the engineering phase of a couple of 100,000s of tons of CO2 being installed. That will be built in the next 3 years, roughly, in the United States, right? And this plant will actually then be extended to 1 million ton of carbon removal capacity per annum. So if you want, there's one step remaining, and we're there. We are operating at the scale that we need. Now, this is, if you want, the technological milestone. The commercial milestone is that this plant, in order to attract the financing that it needs to sell the carbon dioxide removal credits that it generates over 10 years, say 10 million tons on the market already today, right? So that is a very big milestone, and that is again multiplying. Like to date, 8 million tons of carbon removal credits have been sold, and we are intending to sell, I don't know, another 5 to 10 of them in the next 5 years. So it's, this is the single market size at the moment. So you can imagine how big of a task it is to do that. And in such, all levers have to play together, right? We're talking to many different industries: aviation, hyperscalers, financial services, professional services, other hard to abate sectors. And on the other hand, regulation has to kick in, right? And here, like in the very concrete example of aviation, I'm really hopeful and do hope that this will happen quite soon. And that would be a massive catalyst to what I just said.
Wow.
If fuel mandates or if sustainability mandates in aviation were open to treating sustainable aviation fuels and carbon dioxide removal interchangeably, this is this is like a massive game changer, right? This would exactly create the market dynamics that we need in order to fill those quantities that I just said, which are in turn helpful and necessary to build those plants. And we have seen that there's a thing called low carbon fuel standard in California, which is a standard regulating the use of low carbon fuels. And you know what? carbon dioxide removal became eligible for that standard. So there is some precedents out there that standards that were originally developed for fuel opened their doors for carbon dioxide removal exists. And again, my hope, and this is what we are obviously working on, and a very key message I'd like to share, an idea I'd like to share, is that those mandates, if they opened up for carbon dioxide removal, this would have such an important catalytic effect on the market development for carbon dioxide removal.
Wow, this is very, very exciting, I think, time and phase. You've also recently launched Climeworks Solutions, which is a portfolio approach to carbon removal. What prompted this expansion beyond just pure direct air capture?
Essentially, it being a customer need. All customers out there buy portfolios of carbon dioxide removal credits. There are very, very limited amount of customers only buying one specific type of carbon removal. And you know what? It makes absolutely sense. I always tell companies to think about your climate portfolio similar as to your financial portfolio. Of course, there might be some people or companies out there betting everything on one horse, like going all in, but like 99% of all companies or persons thinking about managing financial assets have a very well diversified portfolio. And the same holds true for carbon dioxide removal, especially if something as important as climate change is at stake. So typically companies set up portfolios, and what happened in the past is they contacted us as a very trustworthy, credible player in the market and ask, of course, for our credits, but also ask us, what else are you seeing? What are you thinking about A, B, and C? And so we used to do a lot of advisory work outside of direct air capture, simply because we're a very big team. We're very knowledgeable about carbon removal. And over time, this developed in a customer need. Like companies asked us, hey, is there more that you can provide us? Can you help us to set up portfolios? And in such, today, Climeworks is really a high quality carbon dioxide removal provider that can offer, of course, direct air capture credits, but also today we are a buyer of non-direct air capture credits, which we're then providing to clients in the domain of biochar or afforestation, reforestation credits in order to assemble those portfolios.
Wow. I love the portfolio approach because it zooms out from exactly what you're doing and addresses a core client need. Glad to hear about that.
Well, and more than that, what I think is really important also to think about is to not think in silos. We are technologists, engineers, and out there is nature. And I think it's really important that both have to be working together and have to be combined.
Have a holistic approach.
Yeah, today nature exists at scale. We do not yet exist at scale. So it would be a bummer if we were not using the approach that existed at scale. However, I always say, if fast forward 2050, if we existed at scale and if we were cheaper than nature, humans would probably lean towards only doing tech, but do not care about nature because tech is cheaper than nature. And that's also a bad thing you don't want to have, right? So I think both always have to go hand in hand. And this is also a very fundamental idea of Climeworks Solutions, is that you must not forget about the other piece in order to have like this full portfolio.
I love it. Love the approach. Final question. What gives you the most hope now specifically on the future of sustainable aviation?
The customers and the younger generations, if you want. I think humanity really wants change, right? And that gives me a lot of hope. And aviation caters very intensively to consumer needs, and that I'm very hopeful that also through clients asking for that or making choices based on that change will happen. And sometimes people say we should simply stop flying. I'm of the opinion that doesn't make any sense. I think it's really important that you and I have a chance to meet, else this wouldn't have happened, right? Or that we have some dialogue with each other, that we remain innovative. So I think flying will be part of the game in the future, and it has to be, else we're throwing ourselves back into a stone age. But I think client, and I'm one of them, I'm really looking for what is the most sustainable way of getting from A to B, right? And what is that I can do today in order to enable that? And that makes me very hopeful that the clients will be asking for that. They want a transition, and I'm sure aviation companies will cater to that need.
On that note, Christoph, very, very excited about the growth you've seen, about airlines adopting direct air capture as one of the options in their portfolio, in addition to SAF, in addition to other projects that they're working on, like operational efficiencies. And I hear you, in a hard to abate sector like aviation, where there is actual burning of fuel for the foreseeable future, solutions like direct air capture make a lot of sense to have in their portfolio strategy. The final bit of this interview, Christoph, is what I call the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally. Simple, short questions. So we'll start with your favorite book, for example.
My favorite book, actually, there are many of them, but if I had to pick one, I really like Principles of Ray Dalio. I'm a very principle-oriented person, and I find that an inspiring read.
What's the number one principle that you follow from the book or otherwise?
I don't have a number one principle, to be honest. I have a set of principles, and those are my core values, are actually not my personal core values, but the core values of my family, which are on our fridge. And they are used quite frequently to make choices, make choices about vacation, make choices about our weekends.
Wow.
So I really do live principles / core values, but I'm afraid I'm not on my own, as I have a team.
Right. I hear you. Nice one. I love the application. What's your favorite airline?
Oh, the ones using carbon removal, British Airways and Lufthansa.
All right, politically correct answer. Favorite city?
Zurich, else I'll be living somewhere else.
Favorite movie?
What's your that's a longer answer. I'm not watching movies. I don't have time. Even if I have a 13-hour flight, I have no time to watch it. The last movie I saw was The Jungle Book, I think in the 80s, with my dad in the cinema. That's not a joke. I'm
okay. Okay. I will send you a playlist for your next flight to watch some of those. What is it that you do in your free time?
Family and sports.
Which sport are you into?
Too many, to be honest. Tennis, a lot of endurance stuff like running, swimming, cycling, climbing, and skiing, kitesurfing.
You do these, right? You don't just watch these.
No, I do. I do these.
Yeah, I remember speaking to a friend. He says, "I'm really into football." And it's like, "Great. What position do you play?" He says, "No, I watch footballs." Sitting on the.
It's a fair question. I do this.
Okay, what is something you'd like to learn?
Martial arts.
Okay, I got to be careful around you. What's the best advice you've received?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm a very impatient person as an entrepreneur. Everything is always too slow. The best advice I've received is everything goes in iterations. And this, no matter how hard you try, no matter how perfect you try to prepare something, anyway, it'll go in iterations. So embrace that everything goes in iterations.
Wow. Since we spoke about nature and we spoke about impatience, one of my favorite quotes is from Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. And he has a quote which says, "Nature takes its time and everything works out perfectly."
That's a good
one. So take your time. Christoph, it was a pleasure having you on the podcast, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Shashank. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an I.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Torf in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Lihia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.